Good. So I originally meant to start looking at this excerpt from Constance Fenimore Woolson's In Sloane Street, and my first attempt to record this report was far too long. Uh, so what I ask that you do is pause here and peruse the excerpt I'll include on the handout with my bibliography. I ask that you compare it to Wilde's A Symphony in Yellow, and maybe even return to it when we read The Ambassadors. And think about it as something rooted in a tradition of realism and travel writing, but that also functions as a collection of impressions, particularly impressions of lower class or working women, impressions which might otherwise be overlooked in surveys of the time. And I guess, speaking of which, that's essentially what this report is about. I intend to present a 10 to 15 minute sketch of some historical, biographical, and contextual information about Constance Fenimore Woolson. More particularly, I'll take up what I'll call the Woolson-James problem, which has to do with how and why folks are inclined to read her works like Miss Grief in an intensely biographical fashion due to the nature of her friendship or pseudo rivalry with Henry James. So I think before we get into that too much, though, some basic information. The name Fenimore probably stands out to Americanists who would recognize James Fenimore Cooper, to whom Woolson is related through her mother's side of the family. I bring it up because she took an intense pride in this connection and styled herself as a writer even early in her life. She was also very close to Susan Fenimore Cooper, her aunt, also a published writer, and this sort of literary identity, I guess, or this idea of belonging to a literary sphere was something which was of recurring importance to her. And if you look at, say, like the encyclopedia entry for Woolson, she's usually listed as an American writer. Her career started in this country. She was born in New Hampshire. A lot of her poetry was written in like the 1870s. A lot of her early travel writing, sort of regional sketches, is intensely American. She was also heavily influenced by the Civil War, writing in a letter that the war was the heart and spirit of my life, and everything has seemed tame to me since. That would come back in her novella For the Major. But I think in this course we are in the context of what we're discussing, we're more interested in her career post 1879, when her mother died and she began traveling around Europe. And I would add to that, I think James's Daisy Miller would have been published in 78 or thereabouts. So at the time, there was this particular image in the public mind which was prompting scrutiny of American women abroad. But Woolson also wrote of Europe as this place where it was possible to achieve a self-transformation, which again is something we might link to the ambassadors. But this idea that Europe could be a place of change for someone in that sort of literary world. And indeed, she published her novels while traveling around Europe. She wrote many of her short stories, two collections of which were published posthumously. She became known for these kinds of European sketches, which were impressions of her travel. I think as well as this idea of how that experience of looking for a self transformation might be viewed from a particularly feminine lens, right? There were other voices, of which I'd include James, um, sort of giving the transatlantic expat experience. I think in this latter part of her career, Wilson saw a large part of what she could do or what she could offer as being this other perspective. And so we see a number of short stories, works of fiction, in which we have um, what get categorized as her lonely spinster characters, uh, or these stories with women who struggle to achieve their creative potential as writers, and ultimately, I guess to be quite blunt, die because they've been limited by a male-dominated literary realm. And uh, in her letters, Woolson expresses that she doesn't think women are even capable of achieving true genius as writers. But that's which is often taken out of context, right? But she believes that's because genius, or especially true genius, is a masculine construct, right? Men are gatekeepers, they're these arbiters of taste who decide what genius is. So that women writers such as herself are constantly coming up against this barrier, even if they're great or even if they're talented, such that they will always be seen as flawed, um, not due to actual quality so much as societal position. And you know that from Miss Grief. And this is strongly related. We can see a similar kind of pattern emerge in how Wilson has been treated historically or how she's been treated in criticism. This Wilson James problem I mentioned uh, sort of doesn't seem like in a world of perfect gender parity it would have emerged, right? The two had the two being Wilson and James, right, had a close professional relationship. There was a certain friendship there. uh, James wrote that Wilson was the only novelist writing in English who he regularly read besides William Dean Howells, right? They exchanged a great deal of correspondence. But this sort of idea that there might have also been a romantic element to their relationship, or like ideas of the sort of that there's something sinister going on, can often be traced back to James's uh, biography by Leon Edel. And I think that that idea that there might have been professional respect or that their friendship might have been artistically productive is is significantly clouded by Edel's account, right? He wrote that Woolson had an exalted notion of her own powers, um, and I think he's largely responsible for this characterization of her as a desperate, almost like a sort of groupie, or at least like a blindly adoring fan of James, rather than more recently. I think we've seen characterizations of them exploring them as peers or sort of professionals responding to the same literary moment. But even if you sort of browse this excerpt um, from Adel's introduction to the collection of Henry James's letters, right, you'll see he describes her as this deaf spinster, kind of dismissing her as writing popular fiction for the women's magazines. Um, she's later, if you look down, Miss Wilson was intelligent and often sarcastic and aggressive. She had a history of depression. She had led a lonely, self-contained life, right? And so, at least for a while, I think, and I well, even following, right? There were portions of the literary world who were disinclined to see Woolson as anything more than kind of an interesting footnote within James's story. Um, and there are maybe some valid reasons for reading something like Miss Grief or in Sloane Street or other works, but Miss Grief is familiar to us, and it's probably the most widely anthologized, um, which I guess is its own issue, right? It's anthologized because it's popular to read, because it is representing her relationship with James. Um, but anyway, the comparison happens for the reasons sort of sketched out on this slide, right? That both James and the male writer in Miss Grief are these inheritors of wealth, these writers of, quote, delightful little studies of society. I hope you notice that detail, right? They're both seen as favored by their publishers, or they take on this role of arbiters of taste, while both Woolson and Arona Moncrief are these single, middle-aged, isolated female travelers who rely on a female companion. They're both, to some extent, financially insecure, although Woolson far less so. Um, she, there are sort of moments in her life where she struggled with money, but not to the point of destitution. Um, and notably as well, while we're drawing contrasts, right? In the story, Creef is unknown and unpublished, while Woolson would have appeared in several prominent uh, periodicals by this point, right? Um, but I think it's important to notice that those kinds of comparisons only work up to a point. And uh, what I really wanted to report on, and what I think is worth your time, are what I call the feminist revisions of the Woolson-James problem. Uh, so Cheryl Torresney notes that Miss Grief was written before Woolson and James met. It was published in Lippincott's magazine in May 1880. They wouldn't actually meet and begin their professional personal relationship until later that year. Torresney suggests that Adel's characterization has fueled a tradition of suspecting unrequited love between the two. She argues Miss Grief is better understood through a lens or lenses of gender and class conflict in terms of how it depicts patriarchal institutions. I think a healthier middle ground is argued by Anne Boyd, who writes, quote, "It is very possible Woolson wrote Miss Grief during the interval between her first attempt to introduce herself to James and their eventual meeting," right? So she tried to arrange a meeting between him, and there was like a 5-month gap between when they actually were able to meet. And there are similarities to that attempted meeting and what we see represented in Miss Grief. And so Boyd's view of the text is something more like an experiment with how Woolson thinks that meeting will go, right? Or a play with some of those themes of like, what is it like to be a female writer who admires this male figure, but has to rely on his approval to sort of gain status in a literary realm, right? I think it's easier to see it as sort of an imagined version of an interaction between a Woolson-like figure and a James-like figure, rather than like a literal paralleled like fanfic of their meeting. Um, and I see that again, despite cutting down on the beginning, I'm risking running along on time. But to maybe wrap up a few threads. So the reason this is also sensational, or the reason I think it's the Woolson James problem gets so much attention, is due to the nature of Woolson's death, right? The facts are that she was living in an apartment in Venice in 1894. She fell from the window like 3 or 4 stories, landed in the street, and suffered for 45 minutes to an hour, unable to do much more than groan, and then she passed away. Um, it's pretty definitively believed to be suicide, although that's difficult to prove. She was struggling with depression and heavily self-medicating, like there was a lot of morphine involved. Um, but the source of the popular and scholarly debate is how much James was responsible for her death, right? The traditional sort of Adel-esque view of Woolson as this pathetic figure desperately pining for James is motivated to see their relationship as being um, like a prominent factor in her death. And there are plenty of fictionalized representations of their relationship in which, in both novel and sort of lyric form, in which you're meant to see her as committing suicide as a result of this unrequited love. I think that's overblown because well, quite frankly, it makes for a better story, right? I think there are more compelling cases that have since been made by some of these feminist revisionists, um, that she was struggling with mental illness and frustrated more broadly by the difficulties of producing art, right? Especially within this kind of patriarchal system, right? And I think for that reason I'm more persuaded to take a reading of something like Miss James as more representational than like a literal confessional diary sort of a thing. Um, I think there's a futility of trying to express oneself as a woman in that kind of environment that Wilson is making a point on. And I think it's really dangerous to too definitively say, oh, I know for sure that it was suicide and it's because of James, right? Um, Although the last interesting note that I will end on comes from Sharon Dean in the introduction to the collection of Wilson's letters, and she notices that James advocated for the burning of personal letters to maintain privacy generally, and as kind of an eerie preview, I guess it's not really an echo, although I put that on the slide because it happened before, right? Um, James severely limited the release of Wilson's personal effects after her death, and there's all manner of rumor about he destroyed this, he burned that. Um, the full extent of which is really difficult to know, as is the way of these things. But certainly he ended up playing at least a comparable role to that of the male writer in Miss Grief. And so there's sort of a debate over how he had outsized influence on shaping her legacy one way or another, uh, that I think is itself laden with problems. But again, we have gone well over time. I will end there. Thank you for listening. I'll include a full bibliography on the associated handout so you can get a hold of some of this information if you are interested, or we can take it up as part of our discussion in class. But I think I'm going to end the recording there.